Hey, this is Hernandez here to talk to you about the literature review. It is the biggest, fattest mama of the big fat mamas in this class. It seems scary and upsetting, but really, I take you through it piece by piece. You're going to be okay as long as you stay with me and don't get behind in the process. If I had $1 for every time I said that, I'm all right. Anywho, so let's learn about literature review. Understand that this is kind of a heady assignment, right? So it might take a bit, just like the documentary review. It's not like anything you've ever written before. It might take a bit for you to wrap your mind around what this assignment actually is. So you might need to look over this lesson more than once. You might need to watch this video more than once so you can really understand the expectations for this paper. We're going to be writing it for a month. So it's quite a thing. But you'll want to stay on track and you'll want to rewatch this video to help you understand what's expected here. So the basics of a literature review, here's what's required. It needs to be 6 to 8 pages in length. Don't panic, because remember with the documentary review, I promised you that if you just followed my outline and did the things that I asked you to do, you have zero problem meeting this page requirement. I know it seems daunting, but that's by far the least of your worries with this paper. It needs to be written in response to our course's big question. And we'll talk about that in class. It needs to be guided by your approved research question. It needs to give a comprehensive overview of the conversation about your approved research question, and we will get into that. It, as everything else in this class, needs to be written in a formal academic style. It should be free of any personal bias, so we'll go into that in more detail later as well. It needs to be carefully formatted in MLA that includes in-text citations and a beautiful works cited page. It needs to be perfectly edited and free of any errors in grammar, style, formatting, punctuation, spelling, all that good stuff. But what is a literature review? Because the words literature and review mean different things to us sometimes. So in an academic sense, literature and review mean different things than they normally would. So in this context, the word literature, it doesn't mean like, I'm going to read some literature, like a novel. That's not what it means. It means literature means everything that's been written by experts on the topic that you've selected. So in this case, literature doesn't mean novels. It just means any expert level writing on the topic. And then the word review, sometimes we think of a review as like, I thought this movie was good. I thought this book was bad. It's not a review in that sense. What we mean by review in this academic sense is we're just giving an overview, like a full review of the existing information on the topic that you chose. So literature review means literally an overview of everything that's been written on that topic. So this is an academic thing and you'll use it as you get into research, as you go and earn your graduate degrees and stuff like that. How do you write this paper? The first step is deciding on a topic. So you need to decide on a topic that fits within or answers the big question of the class, and we will talk about that. But this course is guided by a big question. It's in your syllabus, and we'll talk about that in class. You just need to make sure that the topic you choose is an answer to that big question, and then you'll meet with me about it, and I will help you narrow down your topic ideas and choose one that I think will be the best and easiest for you to research. So sometimes you have to choose a topic. Yeah, you got to be interested in it, but you also have to make sure that the research for that topic is viable on both sides. So that's a whole different consideration that I can help you with. Then you got to collect 6 sources on the topic. And I know that sounds like a lot, but Weber State has certain guidelines on these sources. So there's some restrictions on what sources you can use. And they also, it's by the nature of the assignment literature review, you also have to make sure that your sources are balanced and credible. So we're going to go through all of what that means. But Weber State has restrictions on what types of sources you need to use. So you have to have a certain number of certain types of different sources. They need to be balanced, meaning that they represent both or all sides of a situation, and they need to be credible. So this yellow paper that I will give to you, it will help you understand the source requirements, and it'll help you record your sources, what types of sources they are, and where the sources fall on the spectrum of opinion on your topic as well. So this yellow page is really going to help you when you're looking for your sources and making sure your sources comply with Weber State's guidelines. Then you'll compile a works cited page. We'll make sure that you're collecting your MLA information as you go. So every time you find a source, you'll fill out, this might look familiar, you'll fill out an information page on that source. And included on that information page is the MLA information. So you'll already have the MLA information gathered. All you'll need to do is then turn that MLA information into a citation. You'll have a place to talk about the credibility of the source and of the author. And then on the back, you'll pull out your main points and quotes for that. So similar to the documentary review, this paper is meant to be a one-stop organizer for every source. So when you're writing your paper, you don't have to have all your sources lined up. You just have to have these papers in front of you and the information is already compiled. So these are meant to make your life easier when it comes to all of these source requirements. So you'll compile your works cited page and then you'll organize your headings. So in this paper, you need to have 3 headings. So if you think about your topic as a big umbrella, right? What are the supporting spokes of that big umbrella topic? And when you look at your sources, you'll be able to pull out several big ideas that all the sources cover or have in common. By big ideas, I mean sub-points or main points that support the overall point that you're making here. So you should divide those supporting points into 3 headings in your paper, similar to the sections in the documentary review. 3 headings, and then you'll talk about those subtopics of your topic in each heading and talk about the sources that discuss that subtopic under that heading. So you got to take a look at how is my topic going to divide itself into smaller headings, and how then can my sources find their way into each heading. It's important to know that you have to have at least 2 sources under each heading, but you might need to have more than 2 because you have 3 sources that mention this same subtopic. So they should all be in that heading. So you should have at least 2 sources under each heading, but you might be repeating sources within other headings within the paper. So each source might be mentioned more than one time. All 6 sources that you choose have to be mentioned and examined and analyzed in your literature review, and some may be mentioned more than once. So know that you need to integrate quotes, and this paper that we'll collect, you'll do one of these papers for each of your sources. This is a place where you can collect quotes that are going to be really helpful to you. You'll be able to separate the source out into main points and then collect quotes for those main points. It'll really, really help you. So you should have a minimum of 6 direct quotes, but you shouldn't have so many quotes that you're padding your paper length with quotes from other people's ideas. Know that just as always, you have to cite every quote or paraphrase or reference that you use, and every single paraphrase or quotation needs to be properly sandwiched using your quote sandwich handout. Then we start organizing our sources within our headings. What source would make sense to introduce first within your heading? And what sources, what order makes the most sense to organize your headings so the information flows really nicely for the reader? And then we think about, here's an outline for this literature review. And you can see that there's, just similar to the documentary review, there's a overall introduction and an overall conclusion. And then within that, there's 3 headings. And these 3 headings are going to kind of make up the subtopics of your overall topic. And within each of these little headings, that should be able to stand alone as a little mini paper. So each of these 3 headings should have its own introduction and its own conclusion and its own body. And in the body, you're discussing how the sources you found kind of like agree and disagree with one another. So you're going to outline each of your headings separately. And of course, I already have a big, beautiful outline for you. Once you're done outlining each of your sources, then I have a big outline for you to outline the entire literature review. So the outline that you'll fill in just follows the same pattern as the outline that I've given you on this green paper. So make sure that you're using this as a reference whenever you're doing anything for this paper. This outline is the golden ticket, even though it's green. Okay, so For each of your headings, as I said, you're going to need to write a little mini introduction for your heading, giving the reader background information that they need to understand the information in that heading. And then you need to write the body of it. It's basically introducing your sources within that heading, giving me a little summary of each of those sources, and then examining how each of those sources agrees and disagrees with the other sources in that same heading. Then you would give a little wrap up for that heading, a little mini conclusion. You don't need to cover a so what or who cares. You just need to kind of give an overall overview of the heading and kind of re-summarize the connections that you made within that heading for that subtopic. So then you'll write your heading number 2 and you'll write your heading number 3. Just like the documentary review, we're writing this paper from the inside out. And I know it seems crazy, but I promise it makes more sense if you write in the middle of your paper before you try to give an introduction for the whole thing or a conclusion for the whole thing. Writing the middle first ensures that your introduction and your conclusion cover everything that you actually wrote instead of what you think you're gonna write. So that's super helpful. Once you've written all your headings, then you can go into the overall introduction. And as it says on this outline, your introductions start with an attention-getting introduction. Assume that your reader knows nothing about the topic you're talking about. One thing that I like to do is like, what would you need to explain to your grandma or grandpa when they know nothing about this and they're not like with it, with the modern times? What would you need to explain to them to help them understand the rest of your paper? And then you need to include a clear and concise thesis statement. But here's the thing about the thesis statement for the literature review. It's similar to the documentary review in that your thesis statement shouldn't take a side, and moreover, it can't take a side, because a literature review is supposed to be an unbiased overview of all of the points of view on this topic that you've chosen. So you're not allowed to take a side. So your thesis isn't this is right or this is wrong. Your thesis is the fact that experts disagree. That's your thesis. So it's very hard to write an ambiguous thesis like that, but it's important to never take a side, not show any bias, and your thesis statement is that experts disagree on the topic. And then you should preview your supporting points, just like you needed to do with your documentary review. And then once you write your overall introduction, this section really, it gives students a really hard time. So you'll see on your credibility page, your source outline page, it'll ask you in the very bottom line, it'll say, find at least 2 areas of further inquiry for this article. Basically, that's asking, in this source that you selected, what ideas, research, and areas of the conversation did the author not cover? What's left out of here? What research did they not cover? What more research needs to be done? What did they avoid saying? If there's bias in their source, what parts of the conversation did they purposefully avoid covering or not purposefully avoid covering? So what else needs to be said about the conversation in that source? That's what an area of further inquiry is. So it's just, what more do I need to know to get a better picture of the topic of this source? What did they leave out? What else needs to be said, or what else needs to be researched? So for each of your sources, you'll have an areas for further inquiry. So for your paper, you'll just kind of combine those areas of further inquiry that you had on each of your source sheets and talk about that in your literature review. The point of this is, you would, in graduate school, when you're conducting academic research, you would be required to do a literature review before you conducted any research in your field. So you would have to say, what have other experts done and researched in this field? So I'm not repeating any research, right? Because if you're doing research as an academic person, you want to do research that hasn't been done yet. You don't want to repeat research that somebody else has done. So you want to kind of like fill any missing spots or holes within the greater conversation on that topic. So that's what the areas of further inquiry is. What further research needs to be done? What more do we need to know about this topic in order to get an unbiased overview of the topic? So after your areas of further inquiry, then you'll do your conclusion. And this will sound familiar. You should give an overview of what you've discussed in your paper. You should give an unbiased thesis, restate the thesis that you already talked about in your introduction. Give me specific, at least 2, so what and who cares for this topic that you've chosen. and then give me a big picture. And that really leads itself well into a mic drop ending. A big picture is, what's our society going to be like if we don't fix the issue of the topic that you have highlighted? And then what could our society be like if we do address it? So after you're done with your conclusion, it's important to remember that as you're writing, you have 6 sources in this literature review. The first time you mention each of your sources, you must formally introduce that source. So that includes the author's full name or the multiple authors' full names, the full name of the source itself, and like a little bit of a summary of the source, which you also need to cite, because if you're summarizing their words, then that's not your idea. You have to cite it. If you're summarizing their source, you're summarizing their ideas. So you must cite that. So that's only the first time that you introduce the source. And then thereafter, when you're referring to the source, you just refer to it by the author's last name. So there's a rubric for this, a grading rubric. It's on this blue paper that I will give to you. Make sure you read this rubric and understand it. There's no surprises here. This will help you understand how to get a really awesome score on this literature review. And then you'll be expected to edit your literature review through many different lenses. And you should be self-editing your literature review before you bring it in for peer review. What you bring in for peer review should be your 100% best work, because peer reviewing your best work is the best way to ensure that you get 110% your best, right? And that you're improving your skills. If you bring your best in, then we can improve on your best. But if you're bringing 60% of your best, then the literature review is kind of a waste. I'm not the literature review, the peer review is kind of a waste of time. So make sure that whenever you're bringing something in for someone else to look at or for me to look at, you've gone through all these different self-editing lenses. First, you check that it follows the outline. I've done the organization of the assignment for you. So you need to check that it follows the outline and that it's organized the way that I've asked you. You also need to make sure that all the MLA formatting and citation stuff is correct. You also need to make sure that your paper adheres to the rubric, and we'll get a good score on the rubric. And then you also need to make sure that you need to run it through Grammarly several times. You need to make sure that you are using appropriate transitional words and phrases, that you're elevating your writing. You need to make sure that double check for any of those boring words that you could replace with annotative verbs. Make sure every time you're transitioning to a new idea, you're using transitional words and phrases. Make sure that your writing is clear and concise. You're not writing big gloppy sentences that are unnecessarily confusing. Make sure that it's formal. Make sure that it's written in complete third person with zero bias. No using I, me, my, first person pronouns, no using us, we, you, those second person pronouns. And then you should always be having somebody else either read your paper aloud to you or at least read over your paper, because studies show that once you spend time on something, you no longer see what's on the page, you see what you meant. So it's really hard for you to actually notice and fix mistakes because you don't see them anymore. So after you've self-edited, it's really important to understand that you need to give yourself time for that self-editing. So this literature review, you're just simply not going to be able to leave it till the night before. I mean, you can try, but a lot of you did that with the documentary review and it was very unpleasant. So with this literature review, it's a lot of writing. And so I suggest understanding when the due date is and then giving yourself an hour a day to work on it. And then really honestly take an actual break, because your brain deserves the break. And when you come to a piece of writing fresh, your writing is better. I can tell when you've tried to write everything in one shot because you start getting writer's fatigue. Your writing starts out great, and then a few pages into it, I can tell that you got lazy because you just tried to do it all in one go. And that's just not reasonable for papers of this magnitude and this length. So plan now that you're not going to make the time management mistakes that you may have made during the documentary review cycle of writing. So this is the time where you got to consciously improve your skills, because writing these papers should not be like a life or death terrifying experience, right? It shouldn't be terrible if you're spacing it out. But if you're not managing your time well, it's going to be unpleasant, and nobody wants that. There's no need for it to be deeply unpleasant. But you've kind of, the documentary review honestly is sort of a little bit of a diet literature review. It's a mini literature review in a way, in a lot of ways. So you kind of have the documentary review under your belt, and then we're kind of going to elevate those skills and apply them to a literature review. So you've got this and you're in good hands. I've walked students through ever so many literature reviews. The biggest mistake that you can make is getting behind in the process. So decide now that you are going to stay with us, that you are going to engage in this process in the way that it was meant, and you're not going to be that person who decides that the rules and the advice that's always beautiful that comes from me, right? That you're not going to be that person who decides that that advice doesn't apply to you, because it applies to everybody. Anywho, thanks for watching this video. Good luck on your literature review. Make sure to rewatch this video if you have any questions. Okay, thanks. Bye.